asperges mei. Ostende nobis Domine misericordiam Tua. Domine exaudi orationem meam. Dominus vobiscum. Oremus. Exaudi nos Domine Sancter Pater Omnipotens Aeterni Deus. Et mittere digneris sanctum angelum tuum de celis, qui custodiat, foveat, protegat, visitet, atque defendat omnes habitantes in hoc habitaculo, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Domini Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Fratres, agnoscamus peccata nostra, ut aptitimus ad sacram mysteria celebranda. Confitio Deo omnipotente, et vobis fratres, qui peccavi nimis, cogitatione, verbo, opere, et omissione, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, ideo pecor beatam Mariam semper Virginem, omnes angelos et sanctos, et vos fratres orare pro me, ad Dominum Deum nostrum. Miseriatur nostri omnipotens Deus, et missis peccatis nostris, perducat nos a vitam aeternam.
Amen.
Gloria in excelsis Deo. virtutum cuius est totum quod est optimum, insere pectoribus nostris tui nominis amorem, et presta ut in nobis religionis augmento, que sunt bona nutrias, ac vigilante studio, que sunt nutrita custodias, per Dominum nostrum, Iesum Christum, Filium Tuum, qui tecum vivit et reinat in unitate Spiritus Sancti, Deus per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
A reading from the Book of Sirach. My child, conduct your affairs with humility, and you will be loved more than a giver of gifts. Humble yourself the more, the greater you are, and you will find favor with God. What is too sublime for you, seek not. Into the things beyond your strength, search not. The mind of a sage appreciates proverbs. An attentive ear is the joy of the wise. Water quenches a flaming fire, and alms atone for sins. Verbum Domini.
Deo gratias.
Lectura de la carta a los Hebreos. Hermanos, cuando ustedes se acercaron a Dios, no encontraron nada material, como en el Sinaí, ni fuego ardiente, ni oscuridad, ni tinieblas, ni huracán, ni estruendo de trompetas, ni palabras pronunciadas por aquella voz que los israelitas no querían volver a oír nunca. Ustedes, en cambio, se han acercado a Sión, el monte y la ciudad del Dios viviente, a la Jerusalén celestial, a la reunión festiva de miles y miles de ángeles, a la asamblea de los primogénitos cuyos nombres están escritos en el cielo. Se han acercado a Dios, que es el juez de todos los hombres, y a los espíritus de los justos que alcanzaron la perfección. Se han acercado a Jesús, el mediador de la nueva alianza. Verbum Domini.
Deo gratias.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Luca.
Gloria a tibi, Domine.
On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both of you may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man," and then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so when the host comes to you, he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to the host who invited him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case that they may invite you back and you have your repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, good afternoon. Buenas tardes. How's everybody doing? I have part of my homily over here. Okay, so just a couple of announcements before we start. The first one is, I don't have the list. Oh, yes, I do. Here we go. The first one is RCIA classes for adults and high school students begins in September. So if you need to receive any of the sacraments, or if you'd like to become Catholic, those classes begin in September, and the registration forms are available in the entrance area or at the office. Rica va a comenzar en el septiembre para los adultos y los niños en escuela secundaria. Hay formularios de registración en la entrada de la iglesia y también en la oficina. Also, I'm starting a group called the Ramblers. It's a hiking group, and it will, hike different hikes like 8 to 12 miles, somewhere in that range. The first one is going to be September 17th. So if you'd like to sign up for this group, the second one's in October. Even if you can't make this one, you can still sign up for October. Please sign up in the entrance area to the church. Voy a comenzar un nuevo grupo que se llama The Ramblers. Es un grupo para senderismo, casi 8 a 12 miles cada vez, una vez cada mes. Entonces, si está interesada en el primero senderismo o el segundo, hay una formulario de registración en la entrada de la iglesia. Vamos a comenzar el 17 de septiembre a las 8:30 de la mañana, hasta quizás a la 1, no sé. Also, we're looking for adult volunteers and hall monitors or others who have good secretarial organization skills for our Scholastic Explorers program. So please see the information in the entrance if you're interested in helping us with the Scholastic Explorers program. También estamos buscando tutores y voluntarios adultos para ayudarnos como monitores del paseo, y también otros que tengan buenas habilidades de secretaria y organización. Necesitamos su ayuda. Entonces, hay un formulario en la entrada de la iglesia. Si también tiene hijos que están interesados en participando en los exploradores escolásticos, hay un formulario de registración. Es muy importante que registrarse tan pronto que es posible. El más pronto que es posible. ¿Sí, correcto? El más pronto que es posible para saber cuántos niños vamos a tener. So also, if you know any children that are interested that would like to be part of the program, it's from 1st to 12th grade, and it's completely free. Es completamente gratis para los niños. So please register them if you know any children 1st to 12th grade for our after-school program. This Friday is First Friday. There'll be a special holy hour at 7 p.m. and everyone is invited. We're going to have a ceremony blessing the high school students that are in RCIA. So that's at 7 p.m. this Friday. Please come. Este viernes es el primer viernes del mes, entonces tenemos una noche de oración muy especial con los niños en el programa de Rica. Para recibir una bendición, y hay una ceremonia para ellos. Es de los niños en escuela secundaria que están participando en Rica en este año. Entonces, el tiempo de adoración comenzará a las 7 de la tarde este viernes. Entonces, por favor, venga a esta celebración. Also, tomorrow we have the barbecue for the youth, children and juniors oratory. Tonight at 7. Esta noche tenemos un barbecue. No sé en español, barbecue. ¿Es barbecue también? Un barbecue para el oratorio de los niños, los jóvenes y los juniors también. Esa noche a las 7 en el jardín de la parroquia. So last week we spoke about King. You guys are still with me, right? You didn't fall asleep? No está durmiendo? No, promise? Okay. All right. So last week we spoke about King David and the establishment of his dynasty. And this week his kingdom reaches a high point. Actually, this is Father Nick's homily, not my homily. It's the wrong homily. I was like, I didn't write that. I don't remember that. It's de Padre Nicolás. Okay, so today's topic is called Divided We Fall. And it's about, last week we talked about how Saul was the first king, and then he was no good, so God anointed David the king. And then David has a son, Solomon becomes a king, and now Rehoboam becomes a king. Rehoboam is the son of King Solomon. And already in the time of King Solomon, things had started to go a little bit rotten during the time of King Solomon. Even though he was wise and had many gifts, he still made a lot of mistakes. And one of the mistakes that leads to a very tragic event, one of the mistakes that he made is that he starts to mistreat the people of Israel. And he does that by overtaxing them and overburdening them because he has all these building projects going on throughout the kingdom. Building projects for the temple, but also he's building pagan altars for, remember he has 700 wives. You remember that, right? Pretty shocking, right? 700 wives. So anyway, he has the 700 wives, and a lot of them are from pagan territory, so he builds these pagan altars and stuff for in honor of their gods, and he even goes with them to worship these gods. So Solomon is kind of losing his way. And so towards the end of his life, a prophet arises in Israel. His name is Ahijah. And Ahijah, the prophets do interesting things in the Bible. They don't just tell you what God wants you to know, they show you. So they do all sorts of dramatic things to show you what God is trying to say to you. And so Ahijah is a prophet called by God around this time, towards the end of Solomon's reign. And Ahijah stands with a beautiful new coat. He has a beautiful new coat on, and he stands near the gates of Jerusalem. And he's waiting for a man named Jeroboam. So those are three names that you really got to remember for this homily today. There's Rehoboam, who's the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, but don't confuse him with Jeroboam, who I'll mention in a second. So there's Jeroboam, who is an official in Solomon's court. And there's also Ahijah, who's a prophet. So King Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and Ahijah. You with me? All right, so those three names. So anyway, Ahijah is waiting at the gates, and he's waiting for Jeroboam to come, this official of the court of Solomon. And when he sees Jeroboam come towards him, he takes off his beautiful cloak, and he rips it into 12 pieces. And 10 of those pieces he hands to Jeroboam. And he says, God will allow you to rebel against Solomon, who is against Solomon's son, because Solomon is unfaithful. And even though you're not legitimately a king, because you're not, to be a legitimate king of Israel, you have to be in the line of King David, right? One of King David's descendants. Even though you're not a true king in that sense, God will bless you and bless your reign and give you a reign that your family will hold on to for a long time. If you bring the people back to fidelity to him, if you bring people back to God. And so Ahijah hands him these 10 strips, and they symbolize the 10 tribes of the north. That's where Jeroboam's from. And he's going to lead the 10 tribes in the north on a rebellion against against Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And so Solomon is still alive at this time, and Jeroboam is one of the officials in Solomon's government. And so he hears about this, and he's not too happy. So he's going to have Jeroboam killed because he's a threat to the throne. So what do you do when you're a threat to the throne and the king wants to kill you? You get out of town, right? And so he hightails it out of town, and he goes to Egypt. Everybody always goes, I don't know why they go to Egypt, but everybody goes to Egypt when they're hiding out from somebody. I guess it's a good place to hide. So remember that if you ever need to hide. Egypt's a place to go. So anyway, he goes out and hides out in Egypt up until the point where Solomon dies. And when he's in Egypt and he hears that Solomon has died, he goes back, Jeroboam goes back to Israel to meet with King Rehoboam on behalf of the 10 tribes of the north. And he basically says to him, lay off for the people. Stop taxing them so hard. Stop forcing them into this hard labor. Let them go a bit. Ease up on them. And remember, I told you last week that Rehoboam doesn't listen to the wise men of Israel who tell him, don't do that. That's not a good idea. Ease up on the people. Don't get harder on the people. Ease up on them. Don't do what your father did. He doesn't listen to them. He listens to his buddies who are just as dumb as he is. And they tell him, you know what? You show them who's boss. And come down even harder on them. That's what Rehoboam does. So Jeroboam leads a rebellion of the 10 tribes against King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. And the kingdom is now split, and Jeroboam announces that he is the king. He becomes the king of the north. But remember what Ahijah had told him, that God would bless him if he led the people back to fidelity to him, if he led the people back to fidelity to God. But what does Jeroboam do as soon as he establishes the kingdom in the north? Does he lead them back to fidelity? No. Remember when they're wandering through the desert and Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, receives the law, and the people down below are making a golden calf to worship? You remember that scene? Well, Jeroboam repeats that scene, even the words from that scene, that terrible sin in the desert. And he makes not one golden calf, he makes 2. And one he puts in the northern part of the kingdom and the other in the southern part of the kingdom, and says to the people, come and worship the God who saved you from Egypt. That's exactly what the people had said when they were sinning in the desert. And he also develops his own made-up priesthood. Because remember, the priesthood, the true priesthood of the temple, is the Levitical priesthood that exists in Jerusalem with the tribe of Levi. Well, up in the north, Jeroboam makes his own priesthood and their own way of worshiping, and even their own worship sites, so that people don't have to go down to Jerusalem to worship. And you may be asking yourself, why would he do this? Now, the first thing, you may have some sympathy towards them, because we also live in a country, and our country, the United States, was founded by a group of people who rebelled against an overzealous and overtaxing king, right? King George III. But don't be too sympathetic with the North. They kind of mess it all up from the beginning. And it sounds crazy. Why would he do this? Well, he does it for a lot of reasons why a lot of rulers do a lot of crazy things. He needs and he wants to hold on to power. And he knows that if the people keep on going down to the south to Jerusalem to worship God and to be served by the priests of the temple down in the south, that eventually the people are going to calm down over the taxes thing, and they're going to want to reunite with the south. They're going to realize that Jeroboam is no real king, and they're going to want to reunite with the south and be under the true king of Israel. So Jeroboam is trying to keep them nice and busy, nice and distracted up in the north so that they don't do that. Well, things get kind of crazy after Jeroboam. From one generation to the next, up in the north, it gets worse and worse and worse. Now in the south, in the southern kingdom at this time, there's some good kings and some bad kings. Some kings start out good and they end up bad. In the north, it's all bad. All the kings start out bad and they end up even worse than they started, and the next one is worse than them. And so that goes on for a number of generations. But throughout this time, God sent prophet after prophet after prophet to lead the people back to himself. And he would tell them, go tell the people that unless they return to me, I'm going to withdraw my protection over them, and then they'll be on their own. And without my protection, they're going to get clobbered by their neighbors. The neighbors will oppress them and eventually completely wipe them out. Well, they don't change. And in fact, with the prophets, some they beat, some they mistreat, and a number of them they kill, so they don't have to listen to the voice of the prophets. That happens in our own day, right? If you're telling people that something is wrong, they shouldn't be doing something, that they need to be doing something else, today we call it canceling. They want to shut you down. They want to silence you so that you don't speak the truth to them. Well, back in the day, they beat you or killed you until you stopped talking. I think they would do the same thing today if they could get away with it. But anyway, they don't change, they don't listen. And toward the end of the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel becomes what they call a vassal state of Assyria. And it basically means an independent state who's living in servitude to another state. So they have to send taxes and do work and labor for the Assyrian Empire. And that's how they have to live. So now they're not paying over taxation to their own king in the south. They're now paying it to a foreign entity, to the Assyrians. Well, they get fed up after a while of living like this and paying this taxation to the Assyrians and living under the servitude of the Assyrians. And so they rebel against the Assyrians. And remember, God has withdrawn his protection. And they get clobbered because the Assyrians are powerful. They get clobbered by the Assyrians. Those who aren't killed, many of the intellectuals and the religious leaders of the northern kingdom get swept off and taken into exile into Assyria, where they're forced to intermarry with Assyrians. That happens so much so that the people after a while, after a generation or so, forget that they were ever Jewish to begin with. So all the line after that, all the descendants after that, no longer have any recollection that they were ever Jewish to begin with. There are some who survive who are left in the northern kingdom, left in the Jewish territory, even though now it's governed by the Assyrians. They're left there to work the land. And Assyria has also conquered other lands, and they moved those peoples into the land with the Jewish people, and they intermarry. And in the north, the religion of the people that are left, when they intermarry with these other cultures, is kind of a mishmash of Judaism, paganism, and all sorts of different types of worship and things, plus what had been going on in Israel before the fall of the northern kingdom. It kind of becomes a mishmash, and they become very important in the New Testament. Those people who are left are called the Samaritans, because Samaria is the capital. And they become important. And you notice that there's an enmity between the Jewish people and the Samaritans in Jesus' day, but that lasts even to our own day. If you go to Israel, there's still an animosity between the two groups. So what started out with so much hope becomes a bitter disappointment. Next week, we'll talk about what happens to the south. But before we do that, the prophets had a second role besides warning of destruction. And that is, once a calamity happened, the prophets would go to the people and say, you messed it up, but God hasn't given up on you. There's still hope. He still loves you, and he still is calling you back to himself, and he'll never give up on you. All you have to do is turn to him. And so that's the other part of the prophetic witness. So for this week, next week we'll talk about what happens to the southern kingdom. For this week, a lot of times when we hear these stories and stuff, we think only of what everybody else is doing, right? You know, so if I talk about, you know, like if I'm complaining about society or something, a lot of people will listen and they'll be like, oh yeah, I know somebody that does that. Oh yeah, I know these people that do that. We're always thinking about everybody else, right? What everybody else does. And we forget that a lot of those same things exist in me too, right? And in our own communities, in our own families, in our own society, in our own country. Israel wasn't alone in this. Israel is really just the example for all of us, because we all wind up falling into the same things over and over and over again. And so this week, what I want you to do is to think over what has happened with Israel. And don't think just about Israel. Think about our own self. How do I have a rebellious heart? How do I behave? What do I think? What attitudes do I have? What ideologies and ideas do I hold on to that are against what God has spoken? Are against God's law, against the way that God has made us, against his love for us? In what ways do I live with a rebellious heart? And ask the Lord to purify our own hearts and also our own country. Look at our country. In what ways are we a rebellious country, a rebellious community? In what ways have we turned away from the Lord as a country? And there are many, multitude ways. Think over those things this week, and next week we'll bring it all home for you. Now just a couple of words in Spanish, un poco sinopsis en español. Originalmente Israel tenía un reino unido, pero debido a sus pecados y las injusticias de sus reyes Salomón y su hijo Rehoboam, la gente se rebeló del norte y el reino fue dividido. Había unos profetas enviados por el Señor para advertir a los reyes y a la gente que si no se convertían, el reino sería dividido. Pero ni la gente ni los reyes escuchaban el mensaje del Señor. Entonces 10 de las tribus de Israel en el norte se separaron de las 2 tribus del sur. Y después había 2 reinos en lugar de un reino unido. Pero al norte era aún muchísimo más peor que el sur. Su paganismo y su desobediencia al Señor y a la ley del Señor era insoportable. Entonces el Señor removió su mano de protección sobre ellos. Y en muchos años, después de generaciones de infidelidad e ignorando las advertencias de los profetas, el reino del norte fue conquistado por los asirios, sus vecinos. Esta semana, si puede hacerlo, tome un poco de tiempo para pensar en qué manera somos semejantes a los israelitas en la tentación hacia la infidelidad. Y también en qué cosas tenemos ideas, ideologías, actitudes o acciones que son más del mundo que del Señor. Y el próximo domingo vamos a hablar sobre el colapso del reino del sur. Credo in unum Deum.
Amen.
te fratres, meum apesum sacrificium acceptabile, fiat apud Deum Patrem omnipotentem.
Suscite Dominus sacrificium humanus tuus ad gloriam nobis sui, ad unum nostrum Spiritus et Surae Sancte.
Benedictionem nobis Domini, conferat salutarem, sacra semper oblatio, ut quod agit mysterio, virtute perficia, per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Dominus vobiscum,
Et spiritu tuo,
sussum corda,
Habemus ad Domini.
gratias segamus Domino Deo nostro,
Dignum et justum est.
vere dignum et justum est, tacum et salutare, nos tibi semper et ubique gratias agere, Domine Sancte Pater omnipotens aeterni Deus, per Christum Dominum nostrum, cuius hoc merificum fuit opus per speciali mysterium, ut peccato et mortis iugo ad onc gloriam vocaremur, quanum cenus electum, regale sacerdotium, gens sancta et acquisitionis populis diceremur, et tuas annunciaremus ubique virtutes, qui nos de tenebris altum admirabile lumen vocasti, et ideo cum angelis et archangelis, cum tronis et dominationibus, cumque omnia militia celestis exercitus, hymnum gloriae Tuae canimus, sine fine dicentes. Vere sanctum es Domine, fons omnis sanctitatis, ec ergo dona quesum Spiritus Tuo sanctifica, ut nobis corpus et sanguis fiat, Domini nostri Iesu Christi, qui cum passione voluntaria et raderetur, accepi panem, et gratias angens fregit, dedique discipulis suis dicens, accipite et manducate, ex hoc omnes, hoc est enim corpus meum, quod pro vobis tradetur. Simile modo, post quantinatum est, accipiens et calicem, iterum tibi gratias angens et discipulis suis dicens, accipite et bibite exio omnes, hic est enim calis sanguinis mei, novi et aeterni testamenti, qui pro vobis et pro multis effundetur, in remissionem peccatorum, hoc facite in meum commemorationem. Mysterium Fidei. Memore sigitur mortis resurrectionis eius, tibi Domine panem vitae, et calicem salutis offerimus. Gratias agentes qui nos dignus abuisti, essare coram te et tibi ministerare, et supplices te precamur, ut corporis et sanguinis Christi participes, a Spiritus Sancto congregemur in unum. Recordare, Domini, ecclesiae tue toto orbe diffuse, otem in caritate perficias, unicum Papa nostro Papa nostro Francisco, et Episcopo nostro Davido, et universo clero. Memento etiam fratum nostrorum, qui in spe resurrectionis dormierunt, omniumque in tua miseratione defunctorum, et eos in numen votus tui admitte. Omnium nostrum quesumus miserere, ut cum beata Diretrice Virgine Maria, beato Iosuf eus Sponso, beatis apostolis et omnibus sanctis, qui tibi a seculo plaquerunt, aeterne vitae meriamores et consortes, et te laudemus et glorificemus, per Filium Tuum, Iesum Christum. Per ipsum et cum ipso et in ipso, est tibi Deo Patri omnipotenti, in unitate Spiritus Sancti, omnis honor et gloria per omnia saecula saeculorum. Preceptis salutaribus moniti, et benedictioni formati, ademus dicere, Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Libera nos quesumus, Domine, ab omnibus malis, da propitius patum in diebus nostris, ut ope misericordiae Tue adiuti, et a peccato simus semper liberi, et ab omni perturbatione securi, expectantes beatum spem, et aventum saltoris nostri Iesu Christi. Domini Iesu Christi, qui existi apostolis Tuis, patum linguo vobis, patum meam do vobis, ne despicias peccata nostra, sed fidem ecclesiae Tui, eamque secundum voluntatem Tuam, pacificari et coadunari digneris, qui vis serenas in saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Pax Domini sit semper vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Ecce agnus Dei, ecce qui tolli peccata mundi, fiate qui ad cenem advocatis sunt. Domine, nosum dignus, ut enteres sub tectum meum, sed tantum dic verbo, et senabitur anima mea.
Cantabor Domino, qui bona tribuiti, usque quod Domine obligeris me in fine, usque mea vertes faciem tuam, amen. Cantabor Domino, qui bona usque quod bonam consilia in anima mea, dolore in cuore meo perdire, usque exalta vicus Deus super me, cantamo Domino, qui bona tribuit. et exaudime Domine Deus meus.
Illumina oculos meus, nequando dormiami morte. Cantavo Domino, qui bona tribuit
Nequanto dicat inimicus meus, prevalui adversus eum.
Nec exultent in tribulant me, si motus suo. Cantavo Domino, qui bona tribuit
Ego autem in misericordia tua sperabili,
et jurabit por meo in salutari tuo. Cantavo Domino, qui bona tribuit
Oremos. Panem se celestis refecti te, Domine, te precamur, ut hoc nutrimentum caritatis corda nostra confirmet, quantenus a tibi ministrandum in fratribus excitemur, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus.
Amen.
Ite missa est.
Deo gratias.